Hello, thank you for joining us on Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. North Korea said it has test-fired a new type of tactical guided weapon, suggesting it is working on a nuclear weapon that could hit South Korea. And the United States State Department stressed North Korea will face consequences for the provocations. Meanwhile, Sung Kim, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, visited Seoul and met with South Korea's President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol and the key officials in his transition team. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
Those consequences will continue as long as the DPRK continues with its provocations.
In the studio with me is Ken Gause, director of CNA's Adversary Analytics Program. Mr. Gause authored the book, North Korean House of Cards, Leadership Dynamics under Kim Jong-un. Also joining me is Scott Snyder. Mr. Snyder is director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the studio. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure to be here in person.
Nice to be with you.
First of all, North Korea's state media said the regime has successfully test-launched a newly developed tactical guided weapon. North Korea claimed the latest weapon test has significance in enhancing the operation of tactical nukes. Mr. Gause, what do you make of what North Korea claimed?
Well, we have seen North Korea recently begin to make claims about new weapon systems. We've seen them with the hypersonic weapon system, with new ICBMs, and now they are discussing the possibility of having battlefield weapons that will enhance their capability beyond just long-range artillery, which can be rained down on Seoul. So it is not surprising that they would make this claim. But we're a long way away from actually seeing a fieldable weapon.
Mr. Snyder?
Well, I agree with what Ken said. The significance here is that the North Koreans seem to be trying to move toward incorporating nuclear weapons as part of their military battle plan. And that is worrisome in the sense that we know that North Korean conventional power is relatively weak, and they don't have very many tools. And so the thing that I think is concerning is the possibility that North Korea feels that it has to reach for the nuclear card in every instance and at every level in terms of its response.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Snyder, you think North Korea is sending a warning to South Korea that it can use a nuclear weapon against the southern neighbor?
Well, more than that, I think that they're trying to operationalize that capability. And in the context of the gap in conventional capabilities between North and South Korea, that should be very concerning.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Gause, how do you see the possibility of North Korea using nuclear weapon on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think that if under certain conditions, if North Korea were to be invaded, if there was a collapse scenario, potentially there could be use of nuclear weapons. But under normal circumstances, I think that they believe that they have, even though their conventional systems are old and aging, they do believe that that still holds a certain amount of deterrence on the peninsula. The nuclear program is still seen as something that is a deterrent against the United States, which they worry might have designs on North Korea in terms of regime change.
North Korea, up to now, usually had boasted its ICBM capability that could hit the United States territory or continent. So some analysts say maybe this could signal some shift in North Korea regime's policy over its use of weapons. What do you think?
Well, we have seen recent statements that would suggest that there's at least a doctrinal conversation going on in North Korea regarding whether first use of nuclear weapons and things like that. But this conversation, I think, we need to be careful about what is operational with regard to this capability and what part of it is strategic messaging. We have a new conservative administration coming in Seoul. This could be part of a strategic messaging campaign that North Korea is using to set the groundwork for escalation, more so than actually integrating at this point in time a nuclear capability into their operational forces.
I think that the key here, though, is the use of the nuclear threat as an instrument for blackmail or extortion against South Korea. That's what we should be watching. But more broadly, I think that the concept of the nuclear capability as a treasured sword suggests that somehow Kim Jong-un is looking at the nuclear capability as this kind of talisman that would prevent any sort of external threat from challenging his regime, or internal threat for that matter. And so that, I think, is problematic, because I'm not so sure that having a nuclear weapons capability can deliver on the faith and promise that the North Koreans seem to be placing in it.
The conventional thought among South Koreans were that North Korea would never use nuclear weapon towards South Korea. But then, as North Korea had been testing a variety of different weapons over the past few months, we cannot exclude the possibility of North Korea's nuclear attack on South Korea. Do you think the United States extended nuclear deterrence is enough at the moment?
Well, extended deterrence, in a way, it's a problematic commitment, because there's no way to prove, there's no case study that you can point to that shows that the U.S. is going to use a nuclear capability on behalf of the defense of its alliance partners. We simply don't have a historic referent for that. And so what that means is that the U.S. has to work constantly on providing assurance to its South Korean ally that, hey, we are here with you and we're going to protect you. And to also provide messages of deterrence to the North Korean side, saying, well, we have this capability and we have a credible willingness to use it in the event of escalation.
Mr. Gause, is the U.S. offering enough assurance about its nuclear umbrella?
I think it is. When I look at the North Korean nuclear program, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind. One, the North Koreans have not mated a warhead to a missile yet. They have a long way to go, or they have a ways to go in terms of their developing a full-up nuclear capability. They also, Kim Jong-un needs to be able to have a source of legitimacy within the regime. Right now, because the economy is not working, the nuclear program is his source of legitimacy. And so that might explain why we're hearing some of these messages, in addition to the fact that there's been a transition in Seoul in terms of a new government coming in, North Korea using this rhetoric to try to drive wedges between the U.S. and South Korea.
Mr. Snyder, from your earlier response, my impression was that you think the United States is not giving enough assurance. Is that right?
I'm not saying that the U.S. is not giving enough assurance. I think that the U.S. is doing a lot and is really trying to underscore the credibility of extended deterrence. But if you look at the issue from the perspective of Seoul, it means you have to rely on an external party to assure your defense. And if you look at the balance on the Korean Peninsula by itself, you feel vulnerable. And so what I'm simply pointing to is the fact that even despite continued efforts by the U.S. to provide assurances that it will defend South Korea in the event of external attack, we see public opinion polling gradually increasing around the issue of potential nuclear weapons acquisition in South Korea. And I think the primary driver for that really over the long term has been North Korea's nuclear development.
Since you mentioned about the South Korea's possible acquisition of a nuclear weapon, what's your view on that?
No, I think that it would cause all kinds of problems in the region. If South Korea were to get a nuclear weapon or a nuclear capability, North Korea is going to would probably lead to a fundamental shift in North Korean calculus on its own nuclear program. In addition to that, you also have the Japanese who might also decide to get a nuclear capability. And then the way that China looks at the region is going to be in a much more very concerned fashion, which of course could raise tensions, could raise the risk level in the region. That's why I think that the South Koreans should continue, even though I agree with what Scott is saying, relying on an outside partner for this deterrence is something that is probably not optimal from the South Korean point of view, but there are unintended consequences if we start going down the road toward South Korean acquisition of nuclear weapons.
Amid heightened tensions over North Korea's missile and nuclear capability, the U.S. and South Korean envoys paid visits to each other's country. And Sung Kim, the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, even had a meeting with South Korea's President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol. They stressed this meeting wasn't to be interpreted diplomatically, but Mr. Gause, do you think this gives some signs in terms of what we could expect of the future coordination between the two countries over North Korea?
I think it sends a very strong signal that the relationship between Seoul and Washington is going to improve in certain ways. The tension that was there between a progressive administration in Seoul and the United States, it created certain tensions. Now that we've moved to a conservative administration, I think the sides will be more on the same page in view of the North Korea, in how they view the North Korean threat, and more importantly, how they view the relationship of the trilateral alliance between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. I think the potential for South Korea and Japan making some improvement in their relationship is a real possibility under the new administration.
Mr. Snyder, do you think the meeting between Yoon Suk-yeol and Sung Kim was significant?
Well, I do think it was significant precisely because South Korea is in a political transition. And we've seen a pretty vibrant set of early contacts between the Biden administration and the Yoon transition team. It's not surprising at all because the Yoon campaign ran on South Korean policy, really focusing on the relationship with the United States as a centerpiece for foreign policy. And so I think that Yoon and his team are doing exactly what one would expect. If anything, the thing that is notable about Sung Kim's visit is that this private dinner just really reveals the depth of personal context that exists between the U.S. and South Korea to be able to have that kind of meeting before Yoon has actually taken office.
Meanwhile, North Korea's state media reveal the fact that South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un exchanged friendly letters, and North Korean regime for a while seemed to be insulting or even mocking President Moon for a while. Mr. Snyder, why a sudden change of mood here?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out. I see the exchange of letters as a possible insurance policy by Kim Jong-un to open the pathway to diplomacy if he feels it necessary. It also can be a useful tool for trying to generate or foment divisions domestically within South Korea, as you will have an ex-President Moon with a relationship with Kim, and we don't know how the personal relationship with Kim will develop with South Korea's new president.
Mr. Gause, was the letter sort of an insurance policy for Kim Jong-un's side?
I think so. I would agree with what Scott said, and really kind of support the idea that this is also lays the groundwork for driving a wedge between the U.S. and South Korea. Kim Jong-un knows that the alliance between the Washington and Seoul is going to tighten up here. But if he can draw a distinction between the rather peaceful period of the Moon Jae-in period and the following on Yoon period, where tensions may escalate, it really shows to the South Korean public, North Korea believes, that having a progressive in the Blue House might be something that they would prefer versus what they're going to see under a conservative administration, which is probably more testing, possibly provocations and things like that that could create tensions between Washington and Seoul in terms of how they react to those provocations and testing.
One other signal in this transition period that I think is worth noting is that the unification minister designate, Kwon Young-se, made a statement suggesting that South Korean policy toward North Korea should be bipartisan. And to some degree, I think that we could see that as a counter to the risk that Kim Jong-un might try to use his letter writing with Moon as a means by which to divide the South Korean public.
And while the U.S. government says North Korea's escalatory behavior has consequences, it continues to stress that North Korea should come out to the talks. Mr. Gause, do you think the U.S. is willing to offer something new to North Korea? No?
I mean, what the U.S. would have to put on the table to get North Korea to come to the negotiating table is significant sanctions relief, not security guarantees, sanctions relief. And that looks like rewarding bad behavior, and it doesn't play well in U.S. domestic politics. So, and also with the conservative administration in Seoul, there won't be the pressure for the U.S. to make those concessions that there was under the Moon administration. So I do not expect the Biden administration to do what needs to be done if, in fact, they want to engage North Korea, because North Korea has made it very clear that they are not interested in talks for talk's sake. Something has to be put on the table. Concessions have to be made up front for them to come to the table.
Mr. Snyder, what do you think about these U.S. Government statements about urging North Korea to come out to the talks?
Well, for me, the tone suggested for the first time that the Biden administration's patience may not be unlimited, and that it's not just an open-ended offer to come to talks, but that the U.S. might actually seek to more actively use coercive measures designed to open a pathway to dialogue or to limit North Korean choices and make it uncomfortable just for North Korea to sit still.
So you mentioned that Biden administration's patience may not be unlimited, but then what kind of consequences that North Korea can face and feel pressured to change their behavior?
Well, the specific area that I think the State Department has identified and some of the senior official statements have identified is that the U.S. may not sit idly while North Korea continues some of its testing activities and some of its perceived provocations. I think that Ambassador Sun Kim talked about a resolute response to North Korea's provocations. And so we have to watch and see what that might mean.
Mr. Gause, the consequences we can think of is either U.S. rock large-scale joint exercises or more sanctions on North Korea, right?
Well, I think...
Will this change any behavior?
No. North Korea sees making concessions up front only makes them weaker vis-a-vis the United States and its allies. Yes, I agree that the U.S. is potentially going to return with South Korea to more robust exercises. The North Koreans will react to that the way they always react, and they will do something in response to that. Sanctions, with China and Russia sitting on the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, I think that getting sanctions through the UN is going to be very difficult. And then, of course, there would be some sort of kinetic action or military response to this, but I don't think the U.S. has any appetite to go there because of the unintended consequences. It is very difficult to play that sort of game on the peninsula, to try to do something very aggressive to North Korea and hope to get a good response. North Korea is just going to react in a very aggressive manner.
So the alternative here is, as you said earlier, is that U.S. has to be willing to give concession? Is that your...
In my opinion, that is the only way forward in order to get to basically freeze the program. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get denuclearization right now. North Korea has made that very clear. But I think that there is a potential for freezing the program, but you're going to have to put significant sanctions relief on the table to make that happen. But I don't see the U.S. Or South Korea having any appetite for that.
Mr. Snyder, what's your view on this? Because there are, in Washington, dominant view is that you cannot reward that North Korea kind of behavior, right?
Well, I actually think that there may be another pathway through which we get to some kind of talks. Mm-hmm. And that would be a pathway that would involve the escalation of tensions and some kind of crisis, possibly instigated by North Korea. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the other issue that the State Department may be anticipating in some of these statements is the possibility that North Korea resorts to its time-tested strategy of testing a new leader by creating a crisis. Mm-hmm. And so then what you have to do is to think about how to manage the crisis, but also what things look like on the other side. Because on the other side, there may be positioning with regards to renewed diplomatic interaction that can occur and actually be justified by the fact that the crisis has occurred.
Oh. What do you say to that?
I think it's a dangerous game to play. I agree with Scott that North Korea is likely going to escalate when the new administration gets in there. The question is whether we're willing to go up the escalatory ladder along with North Korea, whether North Korea is willing to back down at that point, because legitimacy is on the line. I mean, it means something very serious inside North Korea to be seen looking weak in the face of the alliance. And so when you start to try to use that as a policy forward, you could end up with something, as I said, a lot of unintended consequences. But that may be how it ultimately works out. But in my view, probably the more straightforward way, if you took U.S. domestic politics out of this and South Korean domestic politics out of this, would be putting some sort of concessions on the table as the asymmetrically more powerful force in the region, and North Korea reacting to that. But again, it does look like rewarding bad behavior.
Well, there are a lot of factors in play here, and I think one of the significant ones is the future of the Comprehensive Military Agreement and the Yoon administration's policy on that issue, which the North Koreans could respond to. And I do think that the default approach of the North Koreans is going to be to try to test the new leadership in addition to its missile test, and possibly through some kind of containable confrontation around the border. But now we also have an alternative approach that the Moon administration is signaling, the possibility that Kim could actually just resume some form of dialogue. It's out there. I don't think it's the likely path, but I think that it's interesting that it is an available path.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the U.S. government issued a joint alert warning malicious cyber threats from North Korea's state-sponsored hackers. It said these hackers are generating and laundering funds to support the North Korean regime, and the officials stress that the U.S. will hunt down North Korean-linked hackers who enable North Korea's missile and nuclear programs to continue. Mr. Gause and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be with you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.